So we were talking about employee rights, and then we'll finish with employee responsibilities. And then the third exam is scheduled, and I think there's a Scrivener's error in the schedule because that it says that it was open, that the exam would be open today and then due on the 17th, I think, which is not what I intended. It should be open today. I'll give you next Tuesday to work on it. And then it will be due the following Tuesday. Does that make sense? So you'll have class period next time to work on it. And then it will be due on a week from that Tuesday. I think this is the first mistake I've ever made. So you'll have it due on the 26th of November. All right. And I'll send out an email clarifying that after class so that people will be aware. I apologize for that, but mistakes sometimes happen. All right. Okay. So we were talking about right to work and the issues regarding free riders, which is in places where you have right to work laws like Oklahoma, how do unions survive? Well, it becomes really difficult. There are some unionized shops in Oklahoma, but we don't have a lot of them. And because you can't be forced to join the union or pay the part of the dues that go to collective bargaining in states like Oklahoma. And so it leads to a lot of shops not being unionized, whereas in other parts of the country where they don't have right to work laws, the unions don't have that issue and they have stronger union participation. The Catholic social philosophy, a more interesting question than right to work laws is, if you say that you have a right to a job, who should supply that job? Should we incentivize the private sector to provide those jobs, or should we as a government provide those jobs? This happened during the Great Depression, right? So there were lots of people that were out of work during the Dust Bowl era. Lots of people from Oklahoma moved to, for example, California, and there was enormous social pressure placed on the United States government to fix the problem. And so they did. How did they do that? Well, they came up with something called the Works Project Administration, the WPA. And there are lots of buildings and bridges and parts of infrastructure that were built as part of the WPA. The government basically took it upon themselves to employ people. Now, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not that actually fixed the economy or whether or not our entry into World War II fixed the economy. Because at about the same time that we had this huge, massive Great Depression, we had the start of World War II. And so, obviously that historically put a lot of people to work going into the military and going off to fight. That's no longer the case. That's not the way we fight wars anymore. Starting with the Gulf War and our first entry into getting Iraq out of its neighbor, Kuwait, we saw for the first time in history that starting a conflict didn't actually result in an increase in jobs, because it doesn't take a whole lot of people to fight wars anymore. During World War II and Korea and even Vietnam, there were massive amounts of people that were employed as soldiers in the military, but that's not the way we fight wars anymore, right? We can fight them with smart bombs. And so it didn't actually put as many people back to work as you would think. So who should provide these? Should we incentivize the private sector, for example, to provide jobs? And how do you do that? And what are the implications of that? Another interesting question from a moral perspective is that once you are employed, what is your expectation of continued employment? Generally speaking, in the United States, most states have adhered to the doctrine of employment at will, which meant that you don't have contracts. Now, it's a little different in Puerto Rico, which is a United States territory. They actually have a requirement that if you've employed somebody and they've met the requirements for longevity in employment, they have an expectation of continued employment. You can't just fire them for any reason, right? Now, there are restrictions on employment at will. What are the restrictions? Well, civil rights is one of the restrictions in employment at will. So you can fire, for example, in Oklahoma, anybody for any reason except the wrong reason. What are the wrong reasons to fire somebody? Well, they're found in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it requires that you can't fire somebody because of their race, creed, color, religion, right? Things like that, gender. And so that's a restriction on employment at will. Also, union participation. Generally speaking, unionized or organized workforces have employment contracts. In Oklahoma, I told you that one of the big ones that we still have are police and fire unions, which negotiate on behalf. And so they actually have contracts that specify what you can and cannot do and how you can and cannot discipline, fire, or take adverse action against an employee in the workplace. But those are very limited in places that have a right to work law. And then you can't fire people based on public policy. So what's public policy? The biggest one here are whistleblowers. You can't fire people because they are a whistleblower. What is a whistleblower? Well, it's somebody who points out an interest in public policy, and then you fire them for it. The classic case here would be Enron. There was one employee who basically decided that Enron's accounting practices were problematic. They were creating lots of special project entities, which were subsidiaries of Enron, and they were shifting debt to those special project entities and making the Enron books look better than they actually were. In that instance, you can't be fired if you go to the public and disclose these kinds of things, because we generally think that that kind of thing, particularly with publicly traded companies, is a positive public policy issue. So due process in the workplace. What kinds of rights should you have in the workplace? Again, if you have an employment at will and you don't have a contract, generally these are very limited. Most companies, even mid-sized companies, have sort of an employee handbook. How many of you work someplace that has an employee handbook? How many of you have a job? Anybody have an employee handbook?
Think
Your job?
so. I think. I don't know. I've never looked at it.
They didn't give it to you when you were hired?
No. Well, I'm part-time right now, so
They probably still, if they had an employee handbook,
I'm
they
on the
probably should.
Paycom app. It might be on there.
Okay. Anybody else? This is a problem. There are a lot, I'm willing to bet that some of your companies have employee handbooks, but the fact that you don't know is an indication that, they're maybe not engaging in the best sort of internal marketing practices to let you know what are the standard operating practices and procedures. Usually in at-will employment states, those employee handbooks will say at the very beginning something along the lines of, nothing in this handbook alters the employment at-will status of the employee. They say that so that because the courts have interpreted in many instances employee handbooks to be something like an employment contract, an expectation of continued employment. And that's why they'll put these statements in there, and it becomes a matter of whether or not you can prove that through a pattern in practice that they have basically violated their employment rules and regulations with you. Those usually become, if you are dismissed and you think you were wrongly dismissed, those employee handbooks generally become plaintiff's exhibits 1. And again, they will point to this statement that says nothing in this will alter the employment at will. What they have in many of these handbooks is a progressive discipline policy, which says things like, well, if you have an issue in employment at your job, that the first step is for the supervisor to verbally counsel you, right? That's what it usually says. And then that doesn't result in a written reprimand. However, employment attorneys will tell employers, and they never listen to this, that you should document that some way. Even though it's not a formal written reprimand, you should document, like we discussed, the fact that you're coming in 5 minutes late to work every day, and that's not an acceptable, area of behavior. The next is like a written reprimand, and then finally would be termination. The question is, does that create some kind of due process? There are two types of due process, and I sort of touched on this last time. There are substantive due process rights, and those are things that we find in the Bill of Rights, right? Like the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Well, unless you're a public employee, those don't generally apply. So what we generally focus on in employment in the private sector is, does your company afford you any procedural due process rights? What are procedural due process rights? Well, what do you want if your employer is trying to terminate you? What kinds of things are you going to want in terms of being made aware of the problems and issues? And I can tell you that, having practiced employment law for a long time, employee evaluations are always plaintiff's exhibit. Plaintiff's exhibit number 1 is usually the employee handbook, and plaintiff's exhibit number 2 is usually all the evaluations that they've done on you throughout the years. Yeah, you were gonna had a comment? No?
I misunderstood the question.
Well, the question was, what do you want if your employment is about to be terminated, or some adverse employment is about to occur? Some adverse employment, you're being put back on probation, you're being given a written reprimand. What do you
At
want?
least a notice before.
Okay, that's the heart of due process, procedural due process, is notice and hearing. All right, get it done. Notice and hearing. Now, how much hearing do you have? What are your rights in terms of what you should get if you are suffering or about to be subjected to a negative employment action like termination? Well, notice. What does notice consist of? Well, it's what the problems are, right? And one of the reasons I say plaintiff's exhibits number 2 are always employee evaluations is because, and when I was in the Office of Legal Counsel here at UCO, we would have these supervisors that would want to terminate someone's employment, and they would come to our office and they would talk to either my boss or myself, and I would go through the file, and there would be 12 years, for example, of glowing performance evaluations of this employee. Now, with regard to public sector employees like people at UCO, they actually have more due process rights than you do in the private sector, right? Because we're a government entity, and so there are extra protections, and you get some substantive due process rights when you work for a government. One of those, for example, is, and we talked about this last time, First Amendment rights. You have a lot of First Amendment rights as a government employee because we generally believe that employees should be free in government settings to criticize and to bring to light certain, behaviors that may be problematic. So you have notice and hearing. Well, you're going to want to know what it is that you did. So during the verbal portion of, a progressive discipline policy, you can't come in late every day. So you've been given notice. You've come in late every day for the past 3 months, 5 minutes. That's not acceptable. And then hearing, your opportunity to be heard. Well, yeah, but we agreed that I wouldn't take lunch and I could come in because I'm dropping off my kids, right? Something like that. Who should have that hearing? What do you want in terms of a hearing if you're about to be, for example, terminated? What?
I'm sorry. I was just saying a neutral person.
Yep, get it done. A neutral person. You want a neutral person. So who is that usually? Is it your supervisor, the person who wants to? They're probably not neutral.
Would it be
At
like
that point.
HR?
Yeah, get it done. So it's usually the HR department. that provides someone who is supposedly, supposed to be objective. And that was what I did here at UCO, is I worked with HR to go through the file and say, why do they have 12 years of glowing performance evaluations? And inevitably, the supervisor would say, this was what they always said, I thought that that would motivate them to do better. No, don't do that. People, will take you at your face value. If you tell them that they're doing a great job, they're going to keep doing what they're doing, aren't they? Probably, right? So notice and hearing. So who do you want to have? Well, is it the supervisor? No, probably. In private sector, it's someone from HR. In the public sector, it becomes more complicated. So who do you have the right to have, at the hearing at UCO if you're going to be terminated? If you've met past your probationary period here and you're a staff member, not a faculty member, you have the right to have a grievance hearing in front of other staff and faculty members that are appointed to a grievance committee that will hear the matter and make a recommendation to the vice president for administration if you're a staff member. What happens is that a lot of, particularly in the private sector, they argue that providing these kinds of due process rights interferes with the efficiency and free market ideas of the workplace. Now, that's true. It is inefficient. If you cannot just go in and fire somebody because you've given them some kind of procedural due process, that's going to cost the institution money. There is nothing that a government or a business does, for the most part, that doesn't cost money. At one point in time, just out of sort of morbid curiosity, many, many years ago when I was a political scientist, because I would say these things to my students, that there's nothing that government does that doesn't cost money. I did sort of an informal study of what it costs to change a light bulb in a classroom. So the way that works is if the lights are flickering in the classroom, you have to go to your building captain. I think that's what they called him at the time. The person who was sort of in charge of submitting work requests. So they would have to type up, when I first started, lots of these people didn't have computers. I know this is a shocking revelation. We actually had these things called typewriters that most of the administrative assistants had in their offices. And usually that was who was designated as sort of a building captain. It was usually one of the administrative assistants because they're in the building from 9 to 5, whereas faculty, because we teach at night or we teach online, we teach, varied schedules, are not always here. So you need somebody that's in the building that can take the work order, right? At that point in time, they would fill out a work order request to try and get the light bulb replaced. That would be sent over usually by campus mail to facilities management. So every day the campus mail person would come by, they would pick up the mail, and we had all of these envelopes that you could cross out. They had various lines, and you could cross out one line when you'd sent it and put in somebody else's, and they would route it through the mail system here on campus to facilities management. There was a work order person over in facilities management who would then, sort of figure out who was in charge of replacing the light bulb in that building, and then they would send somebody out to replace it. But before you even got to that point, you had to buy the light bulbs. That cost money because we buy light bulbs not, by going to Walmart and selecting fluorescent light bulbs, but by competitively bidding for the light bulbs, right? Because it's a huge purchase. Any purchase that's over a certain dollar amount, you have to competitively bid or use the state contract. And so you had to start with, well, it costs money. When you go out to bid, we send out a request for proposal, right? Then they have the bids. There's a certain time period. Those are opened by the purchasing department, and then an award is made. Now, we've simplified that somewhat from that time into we now use state contracts to buy a lot of the stuff, state suppliers that have already gone through the competitive bidding process for us. But that adds all to the cost, right? So if you give people, I mean, this example about changing a light bulb, I think at the time I figured it out, it cost about $100 to change the light bulb in a classroom at the time that I did the little sort of informal study. If you figured out the amount of time that it took to get an administrative assistant, the purchasing costs and all of that, and then the person to come in and install the light bulb, I think it was about $100 to change a light bulb. If you take that and you say, well, what is it gonna cost, the institution to provide procedural due process? Well, it can get kind of expensive. Because at UCO, what you have is you have someone from the Office of Legal Counsel that will advise the committee. So you have to set up a committee. You're paying those people on the committee for their time, and they can't be doing something else during the time period that they are serving on that committee. You're taking away from their sort of normal duties that they're doing, right? And you're paying them for that time. Then you have to have the hearing. Then you have a decision, and then it goes up to the vice president, and he makes the final decision. Well, that all can add up. And in businesses, it's the same thing. If you have procedural due process in your employee handbook that provides for a notice and hearing, who does that? How much are you paying this individual in terms of being the HR and the supervisor and providing time? And so a lot of businesses argue that this interferes with their efficiency and their ability to produce goods and services at a low cost. I would argue, the counter argument to that is that I would argue that fundamentally, again, if you want to engage in living the brand, if you want employees to be loyal and live the brand, then if they feel that their workplace is fair, that encourages them to live the brand and to be loyal back to the company. Participation rights in the workplace, workplace democracy. So we're now not talking about adverse employment action, but how much should you listen to your employees about new ideas, right? And opportunities for development of new products and services. Again, this is controversial because management insists that engaging in workplace democracy is expensive. I think I told you that 3M, which is known for adhesives, right, allows their employees a certain amount of time that they can work on projects that are not within the defined scope of their work. And they've come up with lots of things as a result of this. It's been good for 3M. One of the things that I think I told you that they came up with, sort of on accident, 3M is known for adhesives. And one of the things that they came up accidentally was this adhesive that wasn't terribly adhesive, but it's adhesive enough that you can get it to stick to something but still pull off clean, right? That's Post-its that they developed as a result of just sort of allowing employees to experiment and come up with new products ideas, right? So arguments in favor of engaging in workplace democracy, and these will be things that will help build a living the brand kind of attitude or atmosphere, is that it creates conditions of self-respect. It decreases alienation and burnout on the part of employees if they think that you are valuing their input, and it fosters greater social participation in the workforce, right? Now, again, management, if they don't want to engage in participation rights, will say, well, it interferes with my property rights to manage my business the way I see fit. Management has the expertise that employees may not have, and it creates efficiency issues. And those are all things that we have to consider. So I think it's a balancing test. How much do you allow for workplace democracy? And how much do you take into account what employees say? I think that you should have some, but obviously you can't allow employees to just completely do whatever they want, right? You have to have some amount of managerial efficiency. Employee health and safety, these are largely regulated as a result of the muckraking era when employment conditions in many industries were abhorrent and child labor was a factor. We got a result of access to government through the organization of employees, these sort of acts that that ensure that employees have healthy and safe working conditions. So OSHA was passed in 1970. Again, there are degrees of safety. Is anything absolutely 100% perfectly safe? No. Can you create a completely safe working environment? No. But you can minimize the risks. And it's generally a good thing to try and minimize the risks, because if nothing else, it lowers your workers' compensation bill. If you have a lot of claims, I have a friend who owns a business. He owns a tree trimming service, and he's a certified arborist in Norman. That's a business that's sort of inherently risky, because what are they doing? They're cutting down trees. And that requires, in many instances, that employees climb up in the tree to start taking down branches. What happens? People fall. There are equipment accidents. You're talking about sharp, dangerous tools that are being used to do this, right? And so you can't, I mean, it's an inherently risky sort of proposition, more so than, for example, working as a college professor at a university. Privacy in the workplace. What kinds of privacy rights do we have in the workplace? What about your personal area, your desk? Should you have an expectation of privacy in the area, your office, for example, that your employer provides to you? You're shaking your head yes. Why?
Because you wouldn't expect someone to go and disrespect your space and all your things and steal or just snoopy. I think it's disrespectful.
Okay, grab a duck. So again, this runs up against issues of employers being able to control property which they own. My response to that again would be, if people don't feel like they have some degree of autonomy and respect for their personal integrity, it can really decrease morale. But most workplaces now are heavily surveilled. Think about Walmart. When you go to Walmart, how many of you use the self-checkout at Walmart? Almost everybody. Why?
It's faster.
It's faster than waiting for them to check you out, right? If you're buying liquor, it can be a lot slower. You probably need to go through the regular line. Although there are now Walmarts, I visited one not that long ago in Texas, where they had absolutely no checkers. It was all self-checkout. And when you bought liquor or things like that, that required identification, they had people there that would come over and swipe their badge, look your ID, and process the transaction, or help you process the transaction. When you use those machines, they're monitoring you, not as an employee, but as a customer. They're monitoring you. And they're looking to see, and you'll notice that there's usually somebody in those self-checkout areas, and it looks like they're looking at their phone. They're actually monitoring the surveillance system. And if they notice that you, for example, are not scanning every item, the machine will sort of lock up, and they'll come over and they'll say, let me help you with that, right? And then they will help you check out so that they can avoid shrink. It's not just monitoring the customers as they do self-checkout. They also now monitor all of the employees to make sure that they are actually swiping. There are cameras above every single checkout that monitor to make sure that, the checker is not letting their friends come through the line and not scanning items. And it's become pretty sophisticated in terms of their ability to detect shrink through that. So in those areas, there's almost zero expectation of privacy, right? You are monitored and photographed from the second you drive into the parking lot until you leave at a Walmart, throughout the entire process, right? They are monitoring and collecting data. What about electronic privacy? How much privacy should you have in the electronic devices that you have at work? Your emails. If you have a work laptop and you have some personal files on it, should you be able to expect privacy in those? The law says no, right? And most employers say no, because this is, again, a device that they're providing you, and they should be able to control that device. I don't think that in this contemporary era, most of you have a lot of issues with that. Do we actually have much expectation of privacy anymore? Very, very little, because almost everything you do anymore is surveilled. The number of times that you are recorded, photographed, is incredible. It's astronomical. When I first started teaching ethics courses and we would talk about privacy, at that point in time, I think the average American was photographed something like 30 times a day without knowing it. Can you imagine how many times it is now? Because again, Walmart has surveillance in their parking lot. They have surveillance in their stores. Every time you walk past an ATM, you're surveilled. We have surveillance cameras outside here at UCO to, maintain security. So it's a difficult issue, and I think it's one that is becoming increasingly more difficult as the world becomes more and more advanced. We now have the ability, because of this device, one of my friends on Facebook posted something about they would never allow, themselves to be chipped because it's the sign of the beast and the government is tracking you. And I'm like, they're tracking you now. If you have this device, everything you do, how many people actually pay cash for anything anymore? How many of you even have any cash? A couple of you? Most people pay everything by what? Credit card. Right? I mean, it's just, and during COVID, that increased exponentially the number of people who did everything because businesses weren't taking cash as they were worried about infection rates, on money. Money is enormously dirty. It's incredible how many germs are on a dollar bill or a quarter. People are touching it, right? They're sneezing, it's incredible the number of pathogens. And so we've seen a huge increase in the amount of ability for both your employer and governments to electronically surveil you. I know where you are. So I think with regard to rights, what you have to do is you have to balance. There are legal, contractual, and then moral rights. And it's a balance in these areas, trying to get things right. I think that you have to consider employee rights versus employee responsibilities, which is the next topic that we'll cover. So rights are things that we have an expectation of. They're things that people owe to us, our employers owe to us. Our responsibilities are what we owe to others. So for almost every right, there's a corresponding responsibility. One of the things that I use as a classic example of this is you have a right to vote. You also have a moral responsibility to go vote if you're going to exercise that right. Democracy requires participation of its citizens. Now, how many people actually go and participate in presidential elections?
50 to 60%.
It's about 50%. Yeah, you can get a duck. It's about 50% of the people that are eligible to vote actually go vote. That's abysmal. There are other places where the participation rights are much higher. Things like Switzerland have much higher rates of participation in their democracy than we do in the United States. Why is that? I believe in Switzerland, if you don't vote, they can fine you. It encourages you to vote. There's like a tax for not voting. Now, how many people in the United States vote? About 50% in presidential elections. How many people vote when it's not a presidential election? The numbers become absolutely abysmal. If you get down to city elections, something that's near and dear to my heart as an elected official in a municipality, how many people vote? The city of Guthrie is about 12,000 people. There are 3 wards, so I represent about 4,000 people. In the last citywide election for my ward, about 100 people voted. That's pretty low. 100 people decided who was going to represent them. And that person has more impact on your daily life than the President of the United States. And I'd be willing to bet most people have no idea who their city council person is or who their county commissioner is. And those individuals have far greater impact on your daily lives than the President of the United States. Because they are determining the quality of the roads you drive on, the cost of city services that are provided to you. So in Edmond, for example, your city council, how many of you live in Edmond? A few of you live in Edmond. They provide not only water in Edmond, but they also provide the electric. And so your city council votes on the rates that you will incur for paying electric and water. Those impact you every single month. And it impacts the quality of the services that you get. So the narrow view of employee responsibilities is based on agency law. What is agency law? Well, businesses are legal entities in many instances. Most companies now have some form of corporate form because it limits the liability of the owners, right? So even small businesses now will incorporate because there are easier forms. Historically, it was sort of complex to form a corporation. There were lots of formalities that you had to have. They have made it far easier through a number of vehicles at the state level to make the limits of liability much easier. So there are limited liability partnerships, for example, in Oklahoma, limited liability corporations, which allow for a corporate sort of form of liability with less formal structure. So if you had a corporation, you had to incorporate with the state, you had to have an articles of incorporation that was, could be a fairly lengthy document. And then you had to have annual meetings, you had to have a board of directors, you had to have minutes from those annual meetings, and those were all needed to be maintained. Now we have limited liability partnerships and limited liability companies, which allow for, basically you just have to file every year and maintain your status, and then you don't have to have all of the board of directors and things like that. So under this theory of agency, businesses act through, they are legal entities in and of themselves. They are legal persons. And Mitt Romney was made fun of because when he was running for president, politicians get in trouble when they say the truth, when they speak the truth. And Mitt Romney said, they were asking about, limits on corporations. And Mitt Romney said in this sort of off the cuff moment, corporations are people, my friends. And, it made the news and everybody laughed. That's true. Corporations are legal people. What does that mean, that they are legal people? Well, it means that, they're not breathing human beings, but they can own property in their own name. They can sue and be sued in their own name. They are legal entities. And so businesses operate through the acts of agents who carry out the business on behalf of the entity itself. So what are the 3 duties that are owed under an agency theory? Well, there's the duty of loyalty, obedience, and thrift. Now, this one is the most, with regard to ethics, the most controversial. The duty of obedience basically says that you undertake the jobs and tasks that your employer assigns to you within reason. again, these are limited by factors like your, civil rights, your rights under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, your rights under, ERISA and things like that. Those are obviously rights that limit the ability of corporations to tell you what to do. What are some examples of things that are illegal for your employer to ask you to do? Well, they can't subject you to, sexual harassment in the workplace. That's illegal. Even if they're paying you, right? They can't subject you to those kinds of things. But outside of those very narrow limits on what employers can ask you to do, you're expected to perform the tasks that they ask you to do. So if you are an executive, this is going to be far broader than if you are, for example, a line employee who is putting tires on the Buick at the factory. The duty of thrift, to not waste the resources of your employer. What are like the resources of your employer? What are some of the ideas of thrift? I think I talked about this episode of The Office before, the ethics training.
Yes.
And one of the things that they talk about in that is time theft, right? And Dwight insists that he's never engaged in time theft. So Jim, I think it was Jim, takes him on to prove that he is. So every time Dwight does anything that remotely resembles, taking a break or goofing off, Jim's got a stopwatch and he's like timing it to prove that he's a time thief. So not engaging in efficient, taking, extra time at the water cooler. All of those things, could be considered time theft, right? And so you're supposed to avoid these kinds of activities, not taking home and using company property for personal benefit or gain. So I think those are pretty easy and straightforward. The duty of loyalty is the one that becomes more problematic. Why is that? Well, loyalty involves sacrificing something for somebody or something else. So putting your own interest maybe above the interest of the company. Now, why is this controversial? Well, again, if we went back in time, companies in many respects had more loyalty to their employees than they do today. During the 1980s and 1990s, it became very fashionable for companies to look around and decide that, for example, and this is illegal because it falls under the ADEA, that older employees were costing the company a lot of money. Why? Well, they're generally, if they've been there a long time, they're probably being paid more than a new employee. They're probably using more time off than a new employee because older employees have more health issues, generally speaking. As you get older, you have more of these kinds of problems that you spend more time going to doctors. When I was in my 20s and 30s, if I went to a doctor once a year, that was unusual, right? You're healthy, you don't have a lot of issues. When you get to be 51, you have a lot more issues, like I've broken a hip and had to have surgery on that. And, you have more aches and pains. And so companies started basically reducing their force and letting older employees go. There was no loyalty on the part of the company to those older employees. It was just it was a raw calculus. And it's hard to prove these things, but there are cases where people have proven a disparate impact against older employees, for example. Contrast that with sort of the 1950s and 60s, where companies did take care of their employees more. My grandmother was the classified records librarian for Sandia National Labs. So what she did was she classified nuclear documents, cataloged them, and then took them out and stored them in these vaults in the Monsanto Mountains in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The way she got that job was her husband, my grandfather, died of a heart attack at a very young age. And the company, Sandia National Labs, which is a contractor for the Department of Energy, the president at the funeral for my grandfather came and said, Tunny, that's what they called her. Her name was Carlston. Her first name was Carlston. Her father had been in the military, and he named all of his children after his military buddies. So they all had these like odd names. So Carlston was the last name of one of his favorite buddies. And so everybody called her Tunny. I think it was because the family lore is that one of her sisters couldn't pronounce, her dad always called her Honey and couldn't pronounce that. So she started calling her Tunny, and that's what the name stuck. So anyway, the president of Sandia Labs at that time attended my grandfather's funeral because he was kind of high up in the corporation and said, Tunny, we have a job for you. The company took care of the widow. Now, she was qualified for the job. She'd gone to college and she'd been a school teacher in Kentucky before she got married and had children. And so the company gave her this job. That's being loyal to the employee. But in an age in which companies are not necessarily loyal to you, do you owe any loyalty to them? And should companies be loyal to you? Well, again, if we look at internal marketing as being as important as external marketing, in that it encourages employees to live the brand, I think companies should think about what kinds of loyalty they owe to their employees. Because if an employee feels secure in their job and they feel that the company will look out for them, they will probably give more to the company. It's a two-way street. If they don't feel that the company is at all loyal, and this has become very, very prevalent in the contemporary workforce, how do you get a better job? A lot of times companies don't promote from within. They're hiring people from outside. You know, Walmart used to be famous for this. There was a woman that I knew when I was on city council the first time. She was the manager at the Guthrie Walmart. She didn't have a college degree. How did she become the manager? She was employee number 3 when they opened the Guthrie Walmart. And she started out as a cashier and worked her way up to management. Because under Sam Walton, you could do that. And when she retired, she had millions of dollars in stock sharing that the company provided to her. The company was loyal to her. Does Walmart do that now? Can you become a Walmart manager by starting out as a stocker and work your way up? Well, I guess if you go to college, you get a degree, and then you go through their management program, maybe. But they largely don't. They hire externally in many instances for those jobs. So upward mobility is in many instances very limited at a lot of companies. The way you get a better job is to leave and go get a job with another company. What does that do? Well, you can let people go for any reason but the wrong reason, but it's not without cost. There is now a recognition that when you let people go, you will pay probably 1.5 to 2 times the cost in trying to replace that employee as you would have spent if they just stayed. Why? It's expensive to recruit. Again, businesses don't do anything that doesn't cost money. If you are recruiting, you are taking away time that managers and HR have to do other tasks to engage in talent acquisition. That costs money. It costs money to run ads, to find people. And then you have to train them. Most jobs now require greater levels of expertise. The days of being able to just throw somebody onto an assembly line with very little training are over. Most jobs require some level of skill. There are very few that don't require some level of training, and that costs the company money. And so I think it's one of the things that we should think about in terms of trying to get companies to live the brand or encourage a workforce where you have people that are living the brand, that you have both loyalty that goes both ways. This is also tempered in some by professional ethics. What are the codes of ethics that govern various professions? Well, more and more professions are now developing codes of ethics. Now, in the legal profession, I think I told you all this, the legal profession, I view it as a calling because I am subject to the professional rules of responsibility 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. As long as you hold a bar card, you are a lawyer and subject to that. And you cannot, there are things that you cannot do, even to non-clients, and not face consequences of professional responsibility actions maybe being taken against you. So the learned professions, historically, what were the learned professions? Well, they're law, medicine, and the clergy all have pretty sophisticated codes, but we're now seeing these developed more and more in other professions. The City Managers Association, for example, has a code of ethics. We're seeing codes of ethics, being implemented in other professions, accounting, real estate. As these jobs are trying to move from just a job into a sort of career category, you're seeing more and more of these being developed. Now, what should you have in these ethical codes? How do you develop them? Well, the legal profession has a very detailed code. And most of it is predicated on utilitarian ethical grounds. Why is that? Well, it's because if you don't do these things in your law practice, if you don't, for example, take care that you don't steal clients' funds, which is why you're required to have a trust account that you deposit clients' funds into and maintain a detailed accounting of that account, it reflects poorly and people won't trust lawyers. And that would be bad, wouldn't it, overall? If we didn't trust our attorneys, they are a necessary part of society. Lots of people quote, there's a famous quote, I think it's from one of the Shakespeare plays. The first thing we do is we kill all the lawyers. And lots of people use that quote as a suggestion of what we should do to lawyers, right? We've all heard the lawyer jokes. What do you call 10,000 lawyers at the bottom of an ocean? A good start. What's the difference between a dead lawyer on the side of the road and a dead skunk on the side of the road? There are skid marks in front of the skunk. And so people use that quote, the first thing we do, they don't realize, I think it came from the play Henry V, I think. The quote is highlighting that if you kill all the lawyers, it's easier to not engage in enforcement of rights. So it's actually kind of a backhanded compliment. People take the quote out of context for the legal profession. So it's very detailed, it's primarily predicated on utilitarian grounds and deontological ethical grounds. We just think that there are certain things that are maybe not necessarily useful, not necessarily efficient, but that lawyers should engage in. It's not efficient to say that you have to be fair to opposing parties, right? In your vigorous defense of your client's position, you can't be unfair. That's not necessarily efficient. Having disclosure of everything is cumbersome. For example, when I was a corporate lawyer, we had a case, we sued a company that was infringing our trademark. And in that case, in a trademark infringement case, my company had to produce something like 80,000 pieces of evidence in that case, in the discovery process. That's not efficient. Is it? Trial by fire, and by that I mean like no discovery, is far more efficient. But it's unfair to the opposing side. So you have to produce those kinds of things in discovery. And that's just a duty. It's not predicated on utilitarian grounds. Managerial responsibilities and conflicts of interest. So when we think about this, we have to think about corporate versus non-corporate. Again, very few businesses now don't have some form of limiting of liability. And so they have some type of corporate form, whether it be an LLC, an LLP, or the traditional corporation. But again, with regard to these things, these in the corporate form are part of corporate law, the duty of loyalty, obedience, and thrift, right? It generally means that you act in the interest of the principal and not in the interest of the agent in the corporate form, that you don't engage in waste. It's something that happened at Enron. They were creating all of these special project entities, basically to enrich the agents, which were the executives of Enron. You also saw this at other corporate scandals, WorldCom, Tyco, right? The subprime mortgage industry. And so with regard to these types of entities, in the corporate world, you have a duty of loyalty. What does that mean? Well, it means that you don't engage in self-dealing. If you know, for example, that your company is interested in acquiring property, you don't go out as the agent and buy the property yourself and then try to sell it to the company, things like that. Don't engage in misuse of corporate property, things like that. Whistleblowing is another area where, again, I touched on this just a minute ago. This has become controversial. What is it, if you're going to be a whistleblower, that you should do?
Be anonymous.
You think it should be anonymous? Why do you think it should be anonymous? You can have a duck
Because, oh, thank you.
or a bear.
I think being anonymous kind of allows you to be honest without feeling that you're gonna have some kind of repercussion. Yeah.
I mean, in the case of Boeing, some of the whistleblowers have been killed. Conspiracy on if it was Boeing or not, but if it was anonymous, they may have been safer.
Again, you can have a duck. I think I talked about the Silkwood case against Kerr-McGee. The conspiracy theory says that Kerr-McGee killed Karen Silkwood, right? That's the conspiracy theory. There's a movie out I told you about. It's called Silkwood, starring Meryl Streep and Cher. She died on what is Portland Avenue, what becomes Portland Avenue in Oklahoma City, in an automobile crash. And the conspiracy theorists think that, Kerr-McGee basically ran her off the road because she was going to meet with a reporter and reveal that she had, evidence of the fact that the corporation was not engaging in safe workplace environments and were basically allowing for the irradiation of employees at super high levels. So what do you need if you're going to have a whistleblower? You said you should be anonymous. One of the things that anonymity runs up against is if we allow people to be anonymous, how do we protect their due process rights? Because one of the things that you need for due process rights as part of the notice and hearing is how do you combat the charge against you if you don't know who's making it?
You can send in evidence with that as well.
Okay,
So you'd be able to like see both sides and that's not just gossip, I guess.
I guess you'd have to have a neutral agent again in that situation.
to
like
investigate,
Someone that could represent the person that's whistleblowing, so you can stay like.
you can get you can take the bear, not a duck. Yeah, so the problem is that if you don't allow for the confrontation of witnesses against you, it becomes almost like a star chamber proceedings where you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent, and that can be problematic. When I was in the position in the Office of Legal Counsel, students would come to me and they would complain about professors, and I would say, that's fine. If you want to just vent and get this off your chest, I'm happy to listen to you. But in order for me to take any action under the faculty conduct policy, you have to fill out a complaint. And inevitably, they never wanted to do that because, or very few wanted to do that because they were afraid of retaliation by the professor over their grade, which you can understand. Which is why we have a grade appeal policy as well here that requires that if you don't think the grade is fair, you can go before a committee comprised of both faculty members and students. The faculty members have to be from outside. Again, what do you want in terms of this procedural due process? If you're going to have this kind of proceeding, well, you don't want the faculty members coming from the department in which the faculty member who assigned the grade sits. Why? Because they're probably friends. So, you know, it's important that you maintain these kinds of, you know, at least the appearance of neutrality. The interesting thing for me, and when I sat on all of these grade appeal committees, and I sat on a lot of them as the advisor to the committee from the Office of Legal Counsel, the students were always harder on the student than the faculty were. The faculty were always more willing to give the student the benefit of the doubt, particularly if the faculty member that had the grade appeal filed against them didn't have a very good syllabus that provided a pretty detailed, you know, how the grade is calculated kind of expectation. What is it that you're going to be expected to do? So if you're going to be a whistleblower, one of the things that they suggest in terms of ethics is that the threat has to be real, not hypothetical. In the case of Enron, I think it was pretty clear that the threat was real. It was going to impact millions of shareholders. A lot of those shareholders were lower level company employees whose 401ks were completely invested in Enron stock. This happened to a friend of mine who retired from the Williams company, and Williams stock was going up and up and up and up. And his brother, who was my law partner, told him, Marty, you need to diversify your portfolio out of Williams, because if Williams goes broke, he's like, but the stock's going up. And then the stock crashed and he lost about half the valuation. And that happened in Enron, right? I mean, these people were set to be millionaires, and then Enron declares bankruptcy as a result of this, and billions of dollars of employee wealth in their 401ks, which was all based on Enron stock, evaporated. So the threat has to be real, not just imagined. In the case of Connick versus Myers, where we had a whistleblower in the DA's office in Orleans Parish complaining about Harry Connick Sr., there's a public policy interest, but, should the DA be able to manage, for example, I think one of her complaints was that he wasn't assigning people in the best way possible. Well, who are you to evaluate that? Who are you to, well, maybe she was an attorney. So the threat has to be real. You have to seek to prevent the harm through internal means. That means that you have to work through the chain of command. Generally speaking, it means going to your immediate supervisor unless your immediate supervisor is the cause of the problem. And then you have to have a way to go to the next person in command all the way up to, the president and board of directors. So you have to seek to prevent harm through internal means, which is the doctrine of exhaustion. You have to exhaust internal administrative remedies before you go outside the corporation. Because it could hurt not just, the people inside the corporation, but obviously, if you make false accusations, it could affect, if you're in a big corporation, the stock price of lots and lots and lots of shareholders. And so you have to exhaust all of your internal remedies first before you go outside and then become a whistleblower. So we talked a lot about the meaning and value of work and how do we, in a contemporary world, engage or give people meaningful work? Do we have an obligation for that? I think the answer is not everybody can have a meaningful job, but what we can do is we can respect individual autonomy in those jobs that are not necessarily going to be terribly meaningful. And I used Mike Rowe as an example of this. He did all of these, he had this series called Dirty Jobs, and like nobody says I want to rebuild septic tanks. They don't, that's not their dream job. But in those jobs, how do you provide at least a safe and secure working environment if you can't provide meaningful work to everybody? It's basically respecting individuals' autonomy and rights to bodily integrity and things like that. We talked about employee rights. For every right, we generally have corresponding responsibilities. So if I have a right to participate, if my workplace, which UCO does, provides an enormous amount of ability for workplace democracy because we have this idea of shared governance, it means that you also have a responsibility to participate. How do you do that? Well, by serving on committees and giving your input on your expertise, things like curriculum committee. Marketing is a dynamic discipline, for example. I oftentimes wish that I were a historian. I mean, they don't make as much money as the marketing faculty do, but we know, for example, who won the war between the states. It's not changing. It's static. So we have to update the curriculum in marketing quite a bit in terms of what it is that we expect. The biggest thing right now in marketing curriculum is what is the impact of AI going to be on marketing? You can use things like ChatGPT to develop ad campaigns in, really efficient ways. Yeah.
I work part-time as a marketing director for a physical therapist and more, and we've been able to generate pictures based off of a simple prompt. It's really neat.
Yeah.
All I had to do was create a picture of the Grinch wearing Santa's suit and a walking boot, and it created it, and it was actually pretty neat.
Yeah, I mean, they are. Now, using the Grinch may run against
I've already submitted for copyright. I've already submitted for
right?
a reason to use it.
So again, using stock photos that are out there on the internet, are you violating people's autonomy if you're using, stock photos? Those are issues that we really have to think about. How much is this going to impact? Artistic license. One of the things that, the Screenwriters Guild is concerned about is that all of this stuff is out there on the internet, right? And basically AI, what is it doing to generate stories? Well, it's pulling from a database of past stories. Now, is that a violation of the copyright of those artists? Maybe. We have the ability to completely, generate entire productions now using largely combinations of other people's work. I remember the first really big sort of production of a movie that historically, when I was a kid growing up, movies had like one big scene, usually at the end, that had a lot of special effects and stuff. Like most of the movie was not a lot. I mean, James Bond, they had some throughout the movie, and then there's just this like one big scene at the end usually. Well, now the first movie that they really used computer generated graphics and stuff was Van Helsing, I think. And it was exhausting to watch at the time because it was just one action scene after another because it was so cheap to generate that kind of content. And so, thinking about like, are we violating people's copyright? What does it imply for us as marketers if AI can replace a lot of the marketing jobs? I was talking to my dissertation chair, and he thinks that really one of the areas that is safer in the field of marketing is one of the areas that I specialize in, which is sales. Because fundamentally, you can't get a, computer generated being. You could do a lot, but fundamentally, in many respects, sales is still a human relations endeavor, particularly with regard to complex products and services. And so he thought that maybe sales was one of the areas where a lot of the others, in terms of advertising and promotion, as you point out, we're going to be able to, generate through artificial intelligence. I mean, it is fundamentally going to change the way we engage in the world of work. There are these huge technological leaps that we see in society that really do impact fundamentally the way society works. The Industrial Revolution, right? We moved from being an agricultural-based society to being a industrial-based society where people moved away from the farms into cities. That created lots of problems that we had to figure out. Then the post-industrial society, where we stopped manufacturing stuff in the United States and we were basically creating knowledge. Most of the value in the economy was in services. And now in artificial intelligence, it's going to radically change things. So we talked about employee rights, responsibilities, and living the brand. And I think it's important that we think about living the brand because it increases the value of the business if you do some of these things. Obviously, it has to be a balancing act, and getting that balance can be really, really difficult. I'm out of time. So again, you will have the class period next time to work on the third exam, since it will cover through employee responsibilities. And if you got ducks, come see me. Let me just stop the live stream.
Right.